Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, and I'm coming at you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. And I've got a real treat for you this morning. I have Brett Oland. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Bow Valley Credit Union, Alberta. And he has got some incredible news to report. And I say news because, no, up till now, this has not been reported outside of a newsletter that Brett put together for his people at the bank. So we're going to get right into this in a minute, but I can't resist taking a few shots at the opening here at Mark Carney, and I'll be right back with those.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. Okay. Well, what is Mark Carney up to? And before I get into that, please subscribe. We're almost at the 50,000 mark. We can get there within a week with your help. Thank you. And please like the station right now. And I was just corrected that this has been reported on some podcasts, including my good friend Jason Levine, who I want to have back on the show very, very shortly here. But we'll be joining Brett in a second, or mere moments. But I had to draw your notice to this. Would you believe it? And this came from Radio Canada. Again, doing some real investigative reporting on Mark Carney. So it's not just Bermuda. He's not just stashing away billions of dollars in profits in Bermuda. Now it's the Cayman Islands. This guy, it's incredible. And as I said yesterday, if you watched my appearance on Redacted, the reason for Mark Carney for the Liberal Party was this is a man of integrity. This was a man who was going to bring back the luster to the Liberal Party after 9.5 years of Justin Trudeau's floundering and manic modes. Here was a guy who was just so basic. He was a man of integrity, a banker, the governor of the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of Canada, a real establishment figure. And of course, it turns out the man has no integrity. He's stashing all of his profits in tax havens, so he doesn't have to pay any taxes. So without further ado, I want to welcome, and sorry, I have to get rid of this first. I want to welcome Brett Oland to the show this morning. And as I said, Brett is the Chief Executive Officer of Bow Valley Credit Union in Alberta, not far from my old stomping grounds in Calgary and Airdrie. And nice to have you on the show today, Brett.
Oh, thanks for having me. And yeah, I can see what Mark Carney's doing down there in the Caymans. I used to work down there as an investment banker, so pretty interesting stuff.
Well, you put together an 8-page letter for those who conduct business with you. And I must say, before we get in, and I want to start with the news release that came out from the federal government. And as you pointed out, Mark Carney has been very, very busy for a prime minister who was appointed, who has not been elected in his own right, and he's done a lot of financial moves since he got there. But I want to say that we've been calling you the Freedom Banker because many people during the Freedom Convoy were worried about their bank accounts being sequestered, taken over by the federal government, because Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland joked about this, like, no big deal, we can do this. If you support the Freedom Convoy, you don't deserve to be Canadian. You don't deserve to have your bank account. Did you see a big influx of people banking with you at that time, and your customers have more of a interest in freedom? Is that why you can be more truthful about what you see coming next?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We saw a huge influx, and really what happens is it perpetuates itself. So you get people of the same mindset that freedom, liberty, entrepreneurial spirit mindset. And we're owned by our members. We're not owned by shareholders in a foreign country like most banks are in Canada. So basically, it enables us to look at things differently than, sort of following the European oligarchs in whatever infinite wisdom that they have for Canada. So.
Yeah, I see. I see what you mean. I want to go to the news release here because I found this absolutely fascinating. This is the kind of news release that usually goes out on a Friday afternoon because they don't want anybody to notice it. But this one is so, shall we say, camouflaged in fiscal language that most people are not going to understand. They put this out on a Wednesday afternoon. I don't think a single media outlet really covered it. It looked like a so what news release. Government bolsters Canada's foreign reserves by issuing US dollar global bond. I mean, people, and if you read the news release, it's very short. It's about four paragraphs. And let me have a look at the whole thing here. Yeah, with some quick facts afterwards, which really aren't very helpful. But what you're saying is that this news release kicked off a campaign by Mark Carney well, I won't say essentially, the plan, the objective is to devalue the Canadian dollar and thereby devaluing the US dollar. Can you take us through this?
Sure, yeah, and I can just sort of run you through some dates quickly on this. So Mark Carney was voted in as Liberal leader on March 9th. March 10th, they issued that statement at the Department of Finance. March 11th, they actually issued this debt that we're talking about here. And then March 14th, Carney is sworn in, and then off on the 17th, he goes over to Europe to talk to his hires over there. So really what's happening is he's trying to manipulate control of the US dollar, and he's doing that through the Canadian tools that he has to him. So even though it seems quite small, it's in the grand scheme of things, $3.5 billion worth of debt issued. It seems quite small, but what happens is they take it over to the City of London, and in the City of London, they have what's called infinite rehypothecation. So that's a $10 word, but really what it means is they can print as much money, as much currency as they want after that. And so what they do is they take this debt, leverage it up 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, and then with that type of money, you can actually start manipulating the price of US dollars. And the Europeans have done this for decades under what's called the euro dollar system. But effectively, Trump put an end to that with moving to sort of a new rate of pricing dollars. And so they can no longer use the euro dollar system to bully around the US dollar in pricing. So now they're looking for a new tool to be able to do that. Enter Mark Carney, who's been a governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. So he understands the plumbing and he understands how this type of thing works. And so when he's working in lockstep with the Bank of England with something like this, he can actually potentially use it to manipulate the US dollar's price and the cost of debt, which Trump will have no part of, and he will not let this occur again like happened under the euro dollar system.
Okay, so that it sort of begs the question: why is he doing this? What's he up to? Is Mark Carney trying to use Canada and now his position as the leader of Canada so that his European globalist friends can get rich while the Canadian dollar goes into a slide? Is that the plan here?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And this stems back hundreds of years. This is colonialism, but rather than using foreign countries to move goods and services back to the motherland, they just use currency to do the same thing. So rather than moving wheat and gold and cotton back to, say, England to be refined and enrich the citizens of England, they're just using the same tools, except they're using money. the Europeans continue to think of Canada as a colony. They continue to think as the United States as a colony. And basically what they're trying to do is enrich their own people and the oligarchs over in Europe using these colonies in their mind.
Now, if I just go back to this impact slide here. Now, you called this the battle for the soul of Alberta as well as Canada, because what's the effect? Because I understand Premier Danielle Smith is now looking to accept a cryptocurrency, and correct me if I'm wrong, for oil and gas revenues instead of US dollars. And is that a way of getting around what Carney's plan is here?
Well, I'm not certain about the cryptocurrency, but the way you stop this system from happening is basically you pinch the hose and don't give the Canadians or the Europeans access to US dollars. So part of the challenge is that the majority of Canada's trade surplus is in oil and gas products and services. So if we had a $200 billion surplus with the United States, that means that $200 billion of US dollars would flood into Canada, and then they can actually pay for something that I'm terming the loony dollar system to perpetuate. So as long as you can pay the interest payments on this massive amount of debt that they issued, the game continues and you can control the dollars. But if you cut off the flow of US dollars to Canada, then this system won't work. Here's the challenge. The majority of Canada's economy is dependent on getting US dollars from the United States. And so with this new system, basically what you're doing is sidestepping the US dollar, because that's what you want to do, is sidestep the US dollar so the Bank of Canada and the Treasury of Canada can't get access to those US dollars, and they can't perpetuate the system. And you use a system like Danielle Smith proposed of getting paid royalties in bitumen, so oil, rather than in US dollars. And so basically your store of value moves from being in US dollars, where they can perpetuate the system, into something less tangible but still has value, like oil. And what I was proposing is to use gold to be able to do this. And now if you eventually want access to, use that store of value of oil or gold, so at that time you can just basically transfer it back into US dollars, Canadian dollars. But really the crux of the system is having those excess US dollars floating around in the Canadian banking system.
So we have US has a trade deficit with Canada, and it's not, as Donald Trump likes to say, $200 billion. It's more like 60. And it's all as a result of oil and gas from Alberta. If we take that out of the equation, the U.S. would probably have a trade surplus with Canada. But
Correct.
Is it in Canada's interest then not to tie our oil and gas into this trade deficit? Does that give us an advantage, or does it help us to get away from Mark Carney's plan of devaluing the Canadian dollar?
No, absolutely. And basically, if you listen to what Donald Trump has to say, he's basically telling the world, take your ball and go home. And we're not funding the rest of the world's problems anymore. And so he absolutely wants Canadians to look out to other markets and to look to Asia, to look to Europe, to look to Africa, to South America, to give our products and services to those countries. And, it's not a surprise to anybody. The Europeans, both, and Asians like Japan, were begging for Canadian oil and gas. And we've just snuffed out those pipelines and basically said, no, oil has no future in this world. Well, I'll tell you what, whether you like it or not, oil and gas will have a future around the world for probably hundreds of years yet. It's too important of a commodity. There's no substitution for it. And whether Mark Carney and his European oligarchs believe it or not, we're going to have to use oil and gas for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I don't think any sane person would disagree with that, and that's certainly on the right track. Before I forget, I want to continue on discussion of Carney's plan, because I think this is potentially catastrophic, and I think you're pointing it out. But I mentioned at the beginning here, we have Mark Carney now being discovered putting more of his profits in tax havens. He's using the Cayman Islands now, as well as Bermuda. Now, as he's pointed out, this is perfectly legal. And but is it ethical? Is this the kind of behavior we should expect from a man who wants to be the Prime Minister of Canada and who talks about everybody paying their fair share? Does this really draw a large question about Mark Carney's integrity?
Well, I think it probably does because, it's rules for thee, not for me. Most people wouldn't be able to have access to get on offshore tax havens like Mark Carney would with something like Brookfield that he's using. So basically what he's doing is ringing up a bill at a restaurant and saying somebody else has to pay for it, but it's not going to be him. And unethical, I think, is a bit of the tip of the iceberg because it's also hypocritical, it's unpatriotic, and frankly, I wouldn't expect much less from Carney because he's been at this type of thing for years. Something similar to what I pointed out with the loonie dollar system is something even potentially even more nefarious, and it goes right along with his green agenda that he has for people. He's interested in implementing this bill called S243, and S243 basically regulates banks into holding certain amount of capital if they're going to lend out to a certain standard. So basically, we know that Carney has no interest in funding anything that doesn't support his green agenda. So if any oil and gas company comes to a bank in Canada, Carney doesn't want them to lend to them, right? So what he does is increase the capital requirements for these banks to not be able to lend to these oil and gas companies. So it basically snuffs out the capital available for these oil and gas companies, and they move on to a different country and start the production somewhere else. Now, under S243, which Carney spoke at the Senate hearing for in support of, basically it extends far beyond oil and gas and into residential housing, per se. And so if you don't have the proper solar panels on your roof, or you don't have the proper heating system, or you don't have the proper insulation, you won't be able to get a loan from a bank, from the OSFI regulated banks, because Mark Carney regulated this into a position of, sorry, you don't have solar panels on your roof, therefore we can't give you a loan. Or we might give you a loan, but it's going to be, instead of 4, 5, 6%, it's going to be 15, 20, 25% per annum to give you this mortgage, because he's leveraging his knowledge of the banking system in Canada to weaponize it against Canadians.
When you say weaponize it against Canadians, so what's going to be the consequence for the average Canadian who doesn't have a tax haven elsewhere? If you devalue the Canadian dollar, my immediate response is, hey, I think that's going to mean massive inflation, perhaps even hyperinflation. Is that going to be a consequence of this?
Yeah, absolutely. When you basically cut off production, like Carney's proposing here, and you notice how his solution to everything, and we've seen this in the past, we've seen it in the 2008 financial crisis, we saw it in the COVID crisis during 2020, his only solution as a central banker is to print currency. That's it. So whether he prints currency and he gets the Central Bank of Canada to buy it, or he just prints currency and helicopters money to the population like he did in COVID, it's going to be massively inflationary. And it's not a surprise to me that we've seen massive inflation in the past 4 or 5 years because of a result of what happened is they decided to keep people locked in a cage, said you cannot produce any more certain goods and services in COVID, just sit at home and watch Netflix. But don't worry, we're going to print a bunch of currency and helicopter it to you and mail it to you. Of course, that's going to be inflationary. You're cutting off all production in Canada. You're printing a bunch of currency, and it basically devalues every other single Canadian dollar that's out there. So that's really a big message that I have for especially older generations of Canadians that have savings and pensions. It's going to be completely devalued under Carney because he's just going to do the same tricks again. And basically, whenever there's a problem, oh, no production, print money. Oh, there's a pandemic, print money. Oh, trade war with the United States, print money. That's his solution to everything. And the thing is, don't even think about what's happening today, but also what's happening in your bank accounts. So maybe you have $100,000 stored up from working 40, 50, 60 years out there. If your purchasing power in 5 years gets cut in half because of inflation, that $100,000 can only buy about $50,000 worth of goods in 5 years. And it's not a surprise to me. It wouldn't be a surprise to me to see very impoverished seniors going forward if Mark Carney gets into power.
Is that a recipe, a very, very favorable recipe for most Canadians? Now, Carney's first trip as prime minister was not to visit Donald Trump. It was to visit his European friends. He went to France, and he went to Britain. He visited with Macron, and he visited with Keir Starmer.
And the king.
and yes, and the king. And a lot of people said, well, hold it. You've been going on about this trade war with the United States. Why aren't you doing anything on that front? Why are you going to Europe? And Mark Carney's demonstrated that he has very, very thick European ties. In addition to being a citizen of Ireland and the UK, he was the governor of the Bank of England. He also had a scheme, which he tried to push on countries around the world, called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. Mm-hmm. And of course, he's very tied to Europe, but he also has said explicitly over the years he wants China to be the world's economic engine. He wants the Chinese yuan to replace the US dollar. And of course, we've learned recently that he sought a $276 million loan from China last October, which he received. And we know how knee-deep he is in Chinese influence. But you're suggesting it's more about Europe for Mark Carney. Where do you think China fits into all this?
Well, and there are global giants dancing out there, absolutely. And I think China is involved to some degree, and Europe is involved to some degree, Russia, as well as the United States. They're effectively having a war for global power at this point. China, in my mind, to this point, is our business people and are trying to basically manipulate the system for the betterment of their people overall. So now, is there foreign interference? It seems like absolutely there is. I think that the end game for China is a longer one than, say, something for like Europe, because Europe's on death's doorstep. They don't produce anything. They've shot themselves in the foot with this green agenda. They have zero resources. And so basically their only tool is the game of manipulation. And so back to the earlier comments that I've had about colonization, they have a bit of a bee in their bonnet that the United States has never bent the knee to Europe like they thought they were. And this stems back hundreds of years. And so effectively there's a lot at play here. I think Carney's likely playing both sides. He's playing with the Europeans. He's also playing with the Chinese, which really shocks me is he's not having conversations with the United States. Maybe he doesn't feel like he could deal with Donald Trump. Maybe he feels that Donald Trump will just bully him around. I don't know. But the thing is, it's our biggest trading partner. It only makes sense to have conversations with him first. It just baffles me that he's running over to Europe within a few days of his inauguration. And these constant ties to China, I think, are more business driven. But this person, Mark Carney, thinks he's a lot smarter than he is, and he's not. He, I think, has done a very poor job of analyzing the emotion that Canadians are feeling right now. He's a very linear thinker. And so he thinks, well, if there's a problem here, I'm just going to print money. That's the way he thinks. Oh, well, there's, an issue that I can't deal with the United States on. Well, I'm just going to run over to Europe. And he doesn't think about the emotional and Thai consequences of doing things like this. It seems like he's just looking a couple of steps in front of him and not at the bigger game board of world powers that are basically pushing him around.
Yeah, well, your comment on this video that I'm just about to play here, I think it's exactly what you're
Trade
saying.
war may be a trap, and it's not what you may think. What if the U.S.-China trade war isn't a war at all? What if the tariffs, the headlines, and the market panic are part of something much bigger? Right now, China has imposed a 34% tariff on U.S. goods. Trump, in response, is threatening 50%. The world sees conflict, but maybe it's coordinated. Think about it. For decades, the U.S. has been economically drained through unfair trade, global financial manipulation, and one-sided deals mostly influenced by European and British financial institutions. Now Trump comes back on the scene. But instead of launching a direct fight against those entrenched powers in London, Brussels, and Davos, he does something else. He creates chaos. He lets China play the aggressor on paper, triggering market panic. Meanwhile, European elites with billions invested across the U.S. and Chinese markets scramble to reposition their assets, and it's happening. And here's the move. As they shift funds, Trump and his allies watch. They track transactions, offshore plays, strategic exits. Every panic move, well, they log it. Then the trap closes. In April, the trade war resolves, markets rebound, but those who bet against the U.S., well, they lose. And Trump's allies, they buy up what the elites don't. Cheap. Suddenly, Trump holds the leverage. The real enemy isn't China. It's the global financial structure that's been siphoning American wealth for decades. And China, well, they get a weakened Western system, new markets, and a partner in reshaping global trade. Because maybe this isn't a fight between Trump and China. Maybe it's a collaboration, a double bluff, just to expose the old world order and reset the board. Now, I'm not saying this is actually what's happening, but if you step back far enough, you have to admit it's sort of a smart way to play the game, isn't it?
So I think that's almost what you were saying. Like China for Mark Carney is about Mark Carney. It's about getting richer. It's about feeding off a country that is increasingly becoming dominant in the world. But while he's up to that, is there some sleight of hand going on here? Because we're all focused on China, but is Mark Carney more focused on Europe? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the information in time for the Canadian election here on April 28th, sitting on April 11th right now. But over the past week, there's been massive selling of the U.S. treasuries. And so you see it in the bond market. And what happens is when U.S. treasuries are sold, the yields go up. And so the cost of money goes higher. And so it's an inverse correlation. And you've seen that significantly over the past number of days. Like the U.S. 10-year debt has gone up about 75 basis points over the past week, which is really, a really big move. And so somebody is behind selling that. My bet is probably either the Canadians or the Europeans. There probably is a bit of China. There probably is a little bit of Japan. But en masse, it's going to be interesting to see when the data comes out in a couple of months of who is basically trying to collapse the U.S. Treasury market. And they know that the U.S. Treasury market is sacred to the Americans. And so if it gets too unruly, they come in with quantitative easing and basically printing new currency to get the bond market under control. And that's exactly what the Europeans want, is for the Americans to have a weak trade system or a weak treasury system, unable to sort of control the price of their own dollars within the system. So basically, they continue to control through the European banks the price of US dollars. So I'm betting that it's the Europeans that are actually selling the US debt, and it's not China, it's not Japan. And so that is a very big indication of who is trying to control the system is who is selling this U.S. Treasuries. And we'll see that results of that in about June when the data comes out.
Oh, that's incredible. This show is generating a lot of interest, by the way, and we're getting people commenting. And one of the consistent themes people are asking is Mark Carney playing Canadians for suckers? Is this what this is all about? He comes in there as this expert banker, PhD in economics. He knows better than anybody. Is he playing Canadians for suckers for his European friends?
Absolutely, in my mind, he is what he's trying to do, especially with this loony dollar system that I'm proposing, is trying to fit an elephant through an eye of a needle. So the euro is a significant portion of the dollar system. So it's the DXY is a basket of currencies that make up the price of the US dollar. The Europeans control about 83% of that when you stand back and look at it. And so when Donald Trump cuts off the access to the euro dollar system to pricing the US dollar, and that's 83% of the system, whereas Canada only controls about 8% of the DXY, you're trying to thread that elephant through the eye of the needle, and it's going to be massively inflationary, and it's basically going to decimate Canadian savings if he continues to play this game. So absolutely, I think he's just trying to enrich himself, and it baffles me that why he'd even want this position, other than he's a power monger, and he's subservient to his higher elites in Europe.
Yeah, and I think that's something most of our viewers would concur with. Before I get my final question for you, I just want to play this video from Scott Bessent, of course, the Treasury Secretary. Before I do that, though, it's interesting. I find this fascinating that the most obdurate countries in the world on the Trump tariff response were China and Canada. and of course, Mark Carney is on a first name basis with Donald Trump now. I find this all very suspicious. I'm not sure what game Trump is playing, except perhaps to crush the country under Mark Carney. But I find these comments from Scott Bessent extremely interesting.
Good, thank you. And we saw the successful negotiating strategy that President Trump implemented a week ago today. It has brought more than 75 countries forward to negotiate. It took great courage for him to stay the course until this moment. And what we have ended up with here, as I told everyone a week ago, they're in this very spot, do not retaliate and you will be rewarded. So every country in the world who wants to come and negotiate, we are willing to hear you. We're going to go down to a 10% baseline tariff for them, and China will be raised to 125 due to their insistence on escalation.
Okay, so he points out most countries are cooperating, except he doesn't say Canada, but Canada and China are not cooperating. Is Mark Carney not cooperating because he's still using Donald Trump as the primary enemy in this federal election? He's running against Donald Trump, not so much Pierre Poilievre. It's very useful for him politically, especially when Donald Trump's endorsed him twice, and clearly there's something going on between these two. But is that the reason we're seeing the continued reluctance on the part of Mark Carney to even appear reasonable about this?
Well, yeah, and I found it quite ridiculous. And we all know how Trump operates. He throws out these ideas, and basically probably the best thing that people could do is just not react and see how it plays out to some degree. But no, we had to, as Canadians, jump all over this. Orange man bad. We have to push back on this. But here's the thing. With tariffs being put on Canada, that means basically this $200 billion or $60 billion trade surplus that you talk about is drained. So basically that shrinks. And so you lose the power of what I'm terming the loony dollar system. So you can't pay for that debt to control the US dollar like you had if you don't have that trade surplus. So it's no wonder that they're fighting back, Carney's fighting back tooth and nail, because the moment that we don't have a trade surplus with the US, all of a sudden we don't have access to those US dollars and can't perpetuate the loony dollar system. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And further to that, you even saw how the Europeans weren't sure if they were going to retaliate or weren't sure if they were going to retaliate. Why is Canada not in that same boat as the Europeans? It's because likely the Europeans are leveraging Canadians, like, well, we don't care about Canadians in their country, so you can be the test balloon, see what happens if you retaliate against these tariffs. Like it doesn't make political sense. It doesn't make economic sense of what Carney and the Liberal government is doing here.
My final question, and I appreciate you being on the show so much this morning because this is a crucial issue. And I think we're potentially dealing with an economic catastrophe. But what you're saying is we need to ramp up the productivity in this country to get out of a sovereign debt crisis. And that's what's needed. And Pierre Poilievre is essentially saying the same thing, whereas Mark Carney is wanting to take us down a road, a Canadian sucker road, I would call it, to aid his European globalist friends. So can you contrast the two different approaches here?
Yeah, I think they've nailed it around change versus no change. And really what we've been living in for the past 10 years is Canadians have basically just been recycling assets in between ourselves. And it's like, oh, you want to sell your house? I'll buy it. Oh, you want to buy that other house? I'll sell this house. And so basically the real estate market is continuing just to tick higher and higher and higher. And we can no longer continue to do that as Canadians. I think in a lot of ways, Trump did us a big favor by basically saying, hey, you can't be our only trade partner. You have to expand your horizons. And so to be able to do that, you need to increase the capital production within this country. You can no longer continue on that path. So one policy I really liked of Poilievre was that he was going to no longer tax capital gains on the sale of assets if you recycle it back into productive means within Canada. In my mind, that will create an economic boom in this country that a lot of people have just been sitting on assets because they don't want to absorb the tax consequences. If they're able to kick that can down the road a little further, I think it's going to drive a productivity boom within this country. And that's really the solution to get out from under these European oligarchs, to get out from under the United States, to get out from underneath of China. If we are a very productive country within our own right, then we can basically stand on our own 2 feet and we can't be pushed around by any of these conglomerates around the world.
Well, on that note, I'll let you go. That was an incredibly informative session. I'm so glad we did this. The response has been just absolutely incredible from our morning viewers. So, Brett Oland, thank you so much. You're CEO of Bull Valley Credit Union. You've warned your investors about what's coming. I think we need to get this news out far and wide, and I hope I have a part to play in that process. I know you've talked to my good friend Jason Levine about this as well, and other podcasters. I hope you get on more shows to talk about this, because believe me, most Canadians are completely unaware of Mark Carney's plans for Canada. We're focusing on, as you said, we're focusing on China. We're focusing on the obvious things. We're focusing on his tax havens, but we're completely missing this European connection. So, Brett, thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully we can have you on the show again.
Yeah, you bet. If people want more information, just jump on our website, Bow Valley Credit Union CU, and I've got much more materials on this if you want to really get diving into it. So thank you very much for having me.
We'll have
David.
that information as well as your letter to your investors in the description. So that will all be available. So thanks again for joining me, Brett, and Godspeed.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks for having me.
Bye for now. That was Brett Oland, CEO of Bow Valley Credit Union. Incredible information. Thank you for joining us today on Stand on Guard. It's been a pleasure to be here and to talk about this issue. Mark Carney is a man of many faces. This is a guy who can tell you he's doing one thing while with the other hand, he's actively involved in a completely different process. Slippery? Yes. Oleaginous? You bet. And two-faced? Complete. Hypocrisy? That defines him. Hope to be back later this afternoon with Spencer from Make Canada Great Again to talk about his latest exploits, which are incredible. And I'll looking at 4:00. If that doesn't happen, we'll have Spencer on tomorrow or as soon as possible. Thank you so much for joining me today on Stand on Guard. Thank you for supporting this station by subscribing, by liking it, because believe me, I'm here to give you all the news that I can possibly give you that you need to know. And we continue to resolve to resist. So let's remember, fight. Mark Carney is not destined to be elected as Prime Minister. We Canadians still have a choice. We can still vote. And we need a conservative government on April 28th. That's the only solution to getting rid of Mark Carney and his plans for Canada. Thanks for joining me today on Stand on Guard. I'm coming from Ottawa live as every day I do. God bless, Godspeed, and we'll see you tomorrow. I'm David Krayden.